Is it now? Oh, it just wasn't turned up. Okay. We're very pleased, again, I'll start over, to welcome you all today to the first reading of the semester. We're very pleased to have Professor Dean Hughes read for us. He is a wonderful writer and a true professional, and it's particularly sort of poignant because this is his last semester with us on the faculty. He and his wife Kathy, and we'd like to welcome her here. We're very pleased that she would be here today. They are planning to go on a mission, and so this is his last semester. So this is the last chance we'll have for a couple of years to have Dean Hughes read for us. Let me begin with the announcements. My first announcement is always, if you would please silence your cell phones. We would appreciate that very much so that there's no disturbance during the reading. Next week's reading will be Linda Gregerson. She is a nationally renowned poet. She's won the Kingsley Tufts Award, which is one of the premier prizes you can win in the United States as a poet. And today, after the reading, there will be a reception in the Special Collections classroom, which is sort of almost directly behind the auditorium, but you have to go out and go through Special Collections and then to your left. And lovely, delicious refreshments will be served, but even better, there will be books for sale, and you can have Professor Hughes sign your book for you. Our invocation will be given by Rick Walton, and the introduction of Dean Hughes will be made by Holly Hanson.
I'm going to try to get this to work. But as usual, multimedia has failed me. I met Dean Hughes 10 years ago on a road trip. He won't remember this because he wasn't there, but the voice of his book was. I was heading down to Vegas alone, and I knew I'd fall asleep because I was a student and I never got any sleep. So I thought I would get a book on tape. And I walked into Siegel Book on University, and there was a stand of these books in the middle, and I randomly picked it up and said to the book clerk, "So, is it good?" She said, "No, I think so. People buy a lot of them, so I said, all right, I'll take it. And I was a little confused because this is the third book in the series. But I caught on, and then I went back and read, but the other two. But I hit play, and hopefully this will work. I want you to hear what I heard, but I don't think it's going to. Come on. Go! It's not going to do it. It'll come on midway through your speech. Anyway, I heard the voice of this book coming through to me, and I thought to myself, this is not poetic license here. I really did think to myself, if I can write half that good, I could get published. I could be an author. And then 3 years ago, I added a creative writing class here on campus. I was going back to get my master's, and I knew I needed some help getting a writing sample, and I added this class, and it was with Dr. Dean Hughes. And I thought, that was the guy that inspired me to write so many years ago. He is not only a mentor to many aspiring writers, he is a wonderful teacher. He is a patient thesis chair and a friend to all he meets. His most famous novels, Children of the Promise and Hearts of the Children, are not the only thing he has written, but over 90 books on the national and on the LDS market. His most recent novels are Before the Dawn and Search and Destroy, which came out on paperback. And he'll be reading today from a novel that's not yet in print. He's always working on a novel. Dr. Hughes is known for never missing his deadlines. He has written many of you may have known the Lucky and the Nutty book series. You may have grown up reading those. He is well known for his books on baseball and World War II. He has researched quite heavily into both of those topics. He writes and lectures on writing almost constantly. He's always flying this way and that way off to to read, and he got a lot of press with the Relief Society with his book, All Moms Go to Heaven, written one summer when Kathleen was working and Dr. Hughes had to take care of all the kids. So he got a lot of learning about being a mom. He graduated from Weaver State with his BA, and he got his master's degree and PhD in literature from, his MA in creative writing and his PhD in literature from the University of Washington. He spent his early years being a teacher at Central Missouri State University, but then he left fairly shortly after being hired. I think it was 3 years, I think. And then he left and began writing full-time for 17 years. He combined writing and teaching at BYU from 1997 to 2002, and then left to write full-time for 5 years, and then returned again, loved it so much, came back to BYU, which is when I met him. He is soon to leave again, as Dr. Howe is stating that he'll be going on to travel the world with his wife. If you know Kathleen Hughes, she used to be the counselor in the General Relief Society president. Some of you know her more than you know Dr. Hughes. And they are planning on traveling the world via the church. So they have 9 children and 3 grandchildren, no, 3 children and 9 grandchildren, and live in Midway, Utah. Dr. Hughes.
I'm glad to find out that this mission is going to involve traveling the world. I thought it might be getting stuck in some remote place for a long time. Holly, you're nice. That's mine, not yours. That was nice. Holly is a wonderful writer herself and doing some really good things, and you're going to see her name around before long in bookstores as well. I think most of us who are in literature know that the highest form of art, literary art, is poetry, not prose. And so we all admire people like Dr. Howe and Lance Larson and others here. I mean, we have a wonderful group of poets here on campus. And so I really wanted to prove today that I too can write poetry. And so while I have published a lot more prose, I have published some poetry, and I wanted to read from that to start out with. I did my graduate work, as Holly said, at the University of Washington, and I would have been guided by Theodore Retke there, except that he died a few years before I got there. And but his name was holy in all the hallways there, so I always looked up to him as someone I would like to, live up to, being at the University of Washington. Well, here's a collection of poetry, and you see this is a poem here by Theodore Retke. Now I turn over 2 pages, and there's a poem by me. I hope you're duly impressed that I've been collected with Theodore Retke. What do you think? Now, in the spirit of full disclosure, I should show you the front of the book. The title of this book is Monsters, Ghoulies, and Creepy Creatures. And this is my poem. It's called A Silly, Silly Slough. Have you ever seen a silly, silly slough with 6 bow legs standing straight and true, with an inside out that is upside down and a wrong side in that is turned around, and a right side up that is outside in, and a little black beard upon his chin, and a big gold ring run through his nose, with a tinkle, tinkle, flop wherever he goes. Pudding and pickles for dinner each day, and after each feast he sings this way. Chimp, clink, clomp, woo, woo, wee, rattle, prattle, paddle, sue, sue, see. His top side over, his underside wrong, his ear hits his middle and goes bing bong. A flipper that flaps and a flapper that flips, a ripper that raps and a rapper that rips. A slippery belly to slip, slap, slide, a slithery slipper on his left side. His balance is off, but his sides are square, and he sides up when he's going somewhere. Have you ever seen a silly, silly slough? I've never seen one, but I've twice seen 2. But I also do much more serious poetry, and I think you'll find that this one is quite profound. I like ham and eggs better than peas and quiet. But I must watch my P's and Q's. You see, I'm on a diet. Peas I know will make you grow, I really don't deny it, but quiet fattens more than ham, especially if you fry it. Now you have to think about that poem. It has it's not the kind of poem you can just read once and get the whole meaning of it. You have to go back. Well, mostly I write novels, and children's novels, young adult novels, and adult novels. I'm actually going to read mostly from a book that did come out this last year. It's called Before the Dawn. It's a novel. Well, actually, the first part of it introduces it, so I don't need to say that. But I will say that it came out of, to a large degree, my experience of Kathy being so busy in the Relief Society, and her having me read some histories of the Relief Society, and then getting interested in the period during the Great Depression. 1932 is when this novel starts, and I think otherwise you'll understand it. Now this. I'm going to read a fairly good snippet of this, so if you came hoping to get a nap, this might be a good time to get a start. Chapter 1. Leah Sorensen leaned backward, pulling on the leather lines that were wrapped around her shoulder. Whoa, she said, but her horses didn't have to be told. They had already stopped. She twisted the plow onto its side, right handle on the ground, and then guided old Betsy and Barb as they looped back to the furrows they had already plowed. She tugged the plow upright, held the handles high, and leaned a little forward, loosening the lines. She felt the blade dig into the earth as the horses pulled forward, but the steel struck something hard and jerked Leah off balance. She caught herself, winced at the pain in her tired neck and shoulders, but set out again, walking slowly, keeping a loose hold on the horses' bits, mostly letting them take their own pace. It had been a long day, and they were surely as tired as she was. Leah had trudged halfway back across the field, south toward her house, when she saw a Model A Ford turn into her lane. She watched the red dust billow below the car, and she wondered what this could be. A salesman, more than likely, trying to convince her that she needed some implement she couldn't afford. She didn't want an interruption right now. She had to get this field plowed while the dry weather held. The car stopped by her house, and a little man got out. He was wearing blue denim overalls and a worn-out felt hat. Not a salesman, she told herself. It wasn't until he pulled his hat off and waved that she knew who it was. Knew him by his bald head and his big ears. It was Keith Bowen, her bishop. The truth was, he was just about the last person she wanted to see at the moment. But he was still waving, and she couldn't pretend she hadn't seen him. She finished the row she was plowing, then turned the horses and dug in the plow, ready to start a new furrow. She pulled the lines off her shoulder, tied them to the plow handle, and then spoke softly to her horses. "You wait there, Betty, Barb. I'll get rid of the bishop quick as I can." "Hi, Leah," Bishop Brown shouted as soon as she looked his way. "How you doing?" He plopped his hat back on his head and took a few steps toward her. She walked to the fence and said, "I was doing fine until you showed up. What's on your mind?" The bishop grinned. "What kind of talk is that?" he asked. "You're supposed to tell me how glad you are to see me." Leah laughed too. She liked Keith Bowen, had especially liked him before he'd gotten himself called as bishop of the Richard's Second Ward. This is it's supposed to be out in the Uinta Basin, out by Vernal, but there isn't really a town out there called Richards. I invented that. She had been friends with him and his wife for many years, since back in the days when she'd lived in town. "All right, I'll say it. Glad to see you, Keith. Just don't stay too long. I've got to finish this field before dark." The bishop was a sturdy little man, round in the chest, with stubby legs and arms. He ran a gas station and garage in Richards, Utah, nearby, and could never quite wash the grease out from under his fingernails. "Ain't that ground a little wet for plowing?" he asked. "It is, but I couldn't stand to wait any longer. I'm afraid any time now the heat'll set in and we won't get another drop of moisture all summer." "I know what you're saying. That's how it is some years." But he had something on his mind, and Leah could see it, mostly in the way he wouldn't look at her straight on. "So what brings you out here, Bishop?" "I need to chat with you for a few minutes, if you can let them horses take a rest." "Well, actually," she stopped and gave him a careful look, tried to show him with her eyes that she'd meant what she'd said about the plowing. "2 minutes, that's about all, but I need a drink of water anyway. Let's walk to the house." She bent low and pushed down the middle line of barbed wire. The bishop grabbed the upper wire and pulled it high, and Leah stepped through. When she stood straight again, she was close to him, and she felt like a beanpole, her nose about even with the brim of his hat. She turned toward the house, but after a few steps, stopped and looked back. "Hey, Keith, I've got some coffee left over from breakfast," she laughed. "You want me to warm you up a cup? I'll never tell anyone back in town." "I'll say this much, Leah, there's nothing I'd like better. But I've given that stuff up for good now. I'm a righteous man at last." He was grinning again, showing the space in the corner of his mouth where he'd lost a tooth. "What about tobacco? Did you give that up too?" "I haven't chewed for years, never did smoke." "Well, don't ask me to give up my coffee. Some days that's the only thing that keeps me going." She was actually joking about the coffee mostly. She hadn't really made any that morning, and rarely did. But there were days when she wondered how she could keep putting one foot ahead of the other. 12 years back, in 1920, her husband had been kicked in the head by his favorite saddle horse. He'd lived for a few days, but the bleeding in his brain had finally taken him. Such a strange thing, a man who had spent his whole life around horses and loved them so much, to get himself killed that way. Leah had been on her own since then, had raised 2 children by herself, kept the farm going, and learned to do what she had to do. She'd actually grown up on a ranch, but she hadn't really loved that life. So as a young woman, she'd gone to school and become a teacher, and that had seemed to fit her better. But she'd learned things as a girl that came in handy now, as much as anything, just the will to get up early each morning and stay at her work all day. She walked ahead of the bishop to her house, a little white frame place her husband's parents had built when they'd first come out to the Uinta Basin. She stopped on the porch and tugged the laces loose on her muddy boots, then struggled a little, balanced on one foot at a time to pull them off. She dropped her gloves next to her boots, opened the door, and stepped inside. Looking back, she said, "Come in, Keith. How about a glass of water if you won't have any coffee?" "Sure, I could use a drink of water." Inside the house, she felt more self-conscious about her ragged old striped overalls, which were patched in the knees and in the rear end. But she didn't apologize. She got a couple of glasses from her cabinet and dipped him a drink from a bucket she kept in the corner, and then she dipped one for herself. "Sit down," she said, motioning to the kitchen table. "Just don't settle in and get too comfortable." He made a loose little sound in his throat, his way of laughing. And he set his hat on the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. In the same wet voice, he said, "How are you holding up, Leah? Ain't this place a little much for you sometimes?" He glanced around as though he were referring to the roomy old kitchen with the pine cabinets, but she knew he was talking about the whole farm. "I don't know. I don't build time into my schedule for feeling sorry for myself. If I did, I'd probably give up this place, but I don't know what else I would do." "Well, I admire what you've done. I didn't think a schoolteacher woman like you could make a go of it out here, but you've held on when plenty of folks have long since went broke." It's hard to read bad grammar. "That's only because Wayne inherited the farm from his dad, and I haven't had payments to make. This last year was all I could do after I sold my turkeys to pay my taxes and my water assessment. Everyone talks about the Depression like it's something new, but times have been hard for farmers so long we don't know anything else. Would you ever think about teaching school again? Tell me where there's a job, Keith, and if I got it, tell me what they'd pay me. I'm better off here. At least I can grow something for the kids to eat. And you know what we say every year, prices must have hit bottom. They've got to start going back up." She laughed at the thought of it, how many years she'd been repeating those words. "So what's Ray going to do? Isn't she about finished with high school?" "One more year, but Bishop, you haven't been out this way in a long time. I doubt you dropped by to talk to me about the kids and the price of corn. Tell me what's on your mind. My horses aren't going to stand there all afternoon." He laughed again, reached over, and took hold of his hat as though he were getting ready to leave, but he only fiddled with its brim. "Well, now that's true. I did have something I wanted to talk over with you. Don't start telling me I don't go to church enough. I figure I can decide that for myself, and I don't And don't tell me my kids haven't made it into mutual much lately, because I'm the only one who has to pull into your place and pay you 25 cents a gallon for gas if my old car will even start in the first place. You ought to bring that car to me. I'll have to look at it for you. And what would I pay you with? Turkey eggs? He let go of his hat and leaned back. I take eggs and bacon, anything like that. I do it all the time. He gave a little nod, maybe to show he was serious. Well, I might do that sometime, but I've got so I know all that car's bad habits. I can probably fix it about as well as you can. I don't doubt that. You always could manage things. Come on, Keith, tell me what it is you want. All right, we'll get down to business. He took another drink of water and set the glass down, still acting like he had all day. I've had an awful lot on my mind lately, lots to worry about, and that's how I come around to thinking about you. I don't know how much you keep in touch with everybody around here, but there's not a single family that ain't been hit by these hard times. You might think someone like the Willises, they would be all right, but Jim's store ain't doing much business. He told me just a day or two ago he might have to close the Emporium, and if he does, he's got no way of making a living. That might be good for his family. Why do you say that, Leah? The softness in the bishop's tone made her own voice sound brassy. She hated the hardness she felt in herself these days. She had learned, so she leaned forward with her forearms on the table, and she spoke more gently. But still she said, Bishop, there's no one at the high school who lords it over Ray more than Luann Willis. Ray's come home crying more than once because Luann didn't ask her to one of her parties or made some remark about what she was wearing. Maybe the girls need to go through some hard time, or maybe that girl needs to go through some hard times, wear a secondhand dress just once to know what it feels like. I know what you're saying, Leah. Bad times teach us all some lessons. But Jim Willis has worked hard for what he's got. It's a sad thing to see a man lose everything he's worked for the way he just might. I know. I've known Jim as long as you have, and I'm not saying anything about that. But his wife keeps her nose in the air when I walk by, like she's afraid she might smell a little manure on me. I don't like that woman, and I don't like her daughter. She watched the bishop's eyes, saw him react to her harshness. She thought of taking some of it back, but she didn't do it. Well, I'll tell you something, he said. When you get to know folks, what they're thinking and what they've gone through in their lives, all those kinds of things, you feel a little different about them. That's the main thing I found out from being bishop. We all have our good points and bad points, and some people who seem mostly bad, they're just folks like the rest of us. I know that. Lord knows I've got my own faults. Leah felt a little chastised by the bishop's words and surprised. Old Keith was changing, thinking a little deeper than he ever used to. Leah could hear the kitchen clock ticking. She placed her palms on the table. But Keith, come on. Now we're talking about the news and weather again, and you said we were going to get down to business. All right, I know. I was just trying to show how I come around to what I've got to say to you. But that sent him reaching for his glass of water again, and he was still only sipping at it. I'm just saying, lots of folks are going through things they've never dealt with before. Even Clark Evans is having a rough go of it. No one's getting their teeth filled, and he's got rent to pay on that building. Fred Miller in the drugstore says, all right, you made that point. Let's get to the next one. The truth was, Leah didn't feel very sorry for any of those town people. During the 20s, when she had been working herself ragged, he'd watched them act like they were better than she was. They'd had it good back when farmers were the ones going broke. Sometimes Leah didn't go to church because she couldn't start the car, or because she needed to plow or maybe cut hay. But sometimes she didn't go because she wanted 5 minutes to herself and didn't need to sit down with a lot of people who considered her and her children beneath them. She and Rachel, the daughter she called Ray, each had one dress they could wear to church. And it wasn't easy to show up in the same one every time, especially when some women could trot out a whole closet of nice things. Her son, Wade, had a pair of dress pants that were too short on him now, and a white shirt that was frayed at the cuffs, even though Leah had already turned them once. She kept telling the kids that maybe after the harvest they could get some new clothes, but chances were prices would be as bad as last year or worse. Okay, here's what I want to ask you. Bishop Bowen sat up a little taller, as though he wanted to take on some authority. I'd like to call you, or actually the Lord wants to call you, but he stopped as though he had lost his courage. Leah, don't just answer right off when I say what I've got to say. Give it some time and think this over. Not if you're calling me to some church job. I don't have time for it. I'm telling you, it's the Lord who wants you. You have to take that into consideration. Wants me for what? The bishop drew in a long breath. Well, he wants you to serve as our Relief Society president. She heard the words, but she didn't believe them. She laughed a little, then studied them over. He was trying to look solemn as a judge, but he had to be joking. She let go and laughed hard, but Bishop Bowen was still waiting, and that slowed her down. Just in case he really did mean it, she said, "The answer to your question is no. I won't serve as Relief Society president. But you know that. I think you just wanted to scare me and then offer me something that won't sound half so bad." The bishop didn't say anything. He waited until Leah had stopped laughing entirely, and then he sat forward and looked directly into her eyes. "The first time I got some feelings that you were the right one, I told the Lord what you just said, that he must be kidding. But he wouldn't let go of me. He kept telling me over and over, so I told him I'd come and ask you. But I warned him that it didn't seem like you'd say yes. I'm glad the two of you are clear about that much, at least. Maybe I am, but I'm telling you, Leah, this is the Lord's call, not mine. He still thinks you ought to be our president, no matter what I tell him. Don't shake my faith, Keith. I can see where you might get a wrong idea in your head, but I don't want to find out that the Lord has no more sense than you do." She saw him wince at that one, and she knew she had gone too far, but he needed to know she wasn't the right kind of person for a job like that. All the same, he was still looking her straight on, his eyes not wavering. "Listen, Bishop, that's just about the worst idea I've ever heard. Me trying to be a Relief Society president. What in the world would people say?" I'll stop at that point. As you can guess, she does accept, and only after he leaves and he tells her, "What I want you to do before you give your final answer, I want you to pray about this. I want you to get down on your knees, and I want you to tell the Lord you won't do this job, and then you can tell me again." And that just really makes her mad. She feels like that's a vicious manipulation, and she gets really stubborn about it and tells herself she's not going to pray, but she does, and she ends up accepting the calling. And the book is about her learning to handle the calling and learning for the war to handle her. One thing I do want to say about that book, it's called Before the Dawn, and I didn't pick the title. I could not come up with a title to this book, and I debated and came up with bad titles and kept telling my editor, what about this, and finally she came up with Before the Dawn, and I said, "That sounds like a romance novel to me." "No, it doesn't," she said. Well, anyway, everybody at Deseret Book finally decided her titles were all better than mine, and I finally gave in because I sort of agreed, but I still don't like that title. Still sounds like a romance novel to me. I do like Monsters, Ghoulies, and Creepy Creatures, though. I think that's a good title. I just want to read one other short thing, and then I'll see what questions you might have. I've been working on a book that's not a novel. It's kind of a long personal essay for my 218 students who are here. It's going to be called The Cost of Winning, with a subtitle, Coming in First Across the Wrong Finish Line. I didn't think up that title either, but I kind of like it now that I've gotten used to it. I've done a lot of thinking in recent years. One of the things that happens to you as you get older, you start saying, well, how did I do? What if I died soon, you know? How do I feel about what I've done so far? And then you start thinking, hope I got some more time because I got a few things I got to work on. And I sort of picture this scene of going before the Lord and him saying to me, and I don't think it happens this way, but I picture this scene. He says to me, "So how'd you do, Brother Hughes?" And I say, well, I think I did pretty well. You know, I was always active in the church. I accepted a lot of callings and tried my best. And, well, were you kind? Well, I'm kind of impatient, you know, and so sometimes I'm kind, but I kind of lose my patience with people sometimes. Were you meek? Meek? You were serious about that? You know, I never thought much about my meekness. I know you see that a lot in the scriptures, but you know, you got to get by in this world. You know, you got to get out there and make a go of it. And you know, I don't think meekness pays off very well. And then he says, well, here it does. Something like that. And I've noticed that we read the scriptures and there's all this stuff about kindness and meekness and patience and long-suffering, gentleness and so forth. And I think we often go through life trying to make a living, trying to be important, trying to excel, following a dream. We got all these things in our head, and often it seems to me that maybe when we finally have to answer for our lives, we will realize that a lot of the stuff we worked very hard on and cared a lot about really doesn't matter very much. Like being a writer. And that some of the things we didn't work very hard on, like being kind and gentle and meek, humble, those things might be awfully important. We might think, I wish I'd worked more on that stuff. So I've been writing about that, and about materialism, and about winning. I've got a scene in it, a really mean scene at a bunch of fathers acting out of, acting in a brutally unkind way towards a kid who's pitching because they want, I mean, these are fathers of kids who are out playing Little League Baseball, and the fathers are working over the pitchers, screaming at him, you can't throw a strike, you know you can't throw a strike, you know, and you know, just the way sports, for instance, can bring the worst out of us. Not that that would ever happen at BYU, but you know what I'm talking about? That we get awfully concerned about things that maybe aren't as important as they seem. So what do you do about it? And so I have this, in one of the last chapters, I talk about the method of self-talk, that you frame the situation you're in and try to say to yourself, this is how I've usually handled this, but how should I handle it? Here's a classic example. If you're driving down the highway and someone cuts you off, what are you supposed to do? You honk your horn, right? And you scream. You know, words like idiot and bozo and clown and stupid and, you know, words of that kind. That's one way to handle it. And maybe it doesn't really hurt anything after all because he didn't hear what you screamed. You just screamed it in your car. Or maybe it does hurt. For one thing, he sees your reaction, he hears your horn honk, and you know how you feel. How's this for a reaction? I've done that myself. You ever cut anyone off? If you've been driving more than 2 or 3 months, I'll bet you have. We've all failed to see someone in that blind spot. We've all moved over from one lane to another and cut somebody off and had that guy scream at us, and we're thinking, oh, I'm sorry, gee, that was stupid. But, you know, somebody is always somebody else's stupid guy. And yet we go around, what a bunch of idiots around here, and you know, and going around with this sort of hostile attitude. And so what I've been wondering is how do you get over that? By saying, this is one of those times, and I've done that myself, or some phrase that causes you to think, wait a minute, how should I really think about this? Okay, so I'm just going to read one experience that I talk about here and how a situation like that can come up and what you can do. This is a true story. Let me tell a little story that illustrates one thing that has had a good effect on my efforts. One Saturday morning, I needed to wash my car and didn't have much time. I decided to go to an automatic car wash where I could get the job done in about 5 minutes. Raymond, this is at Smith's, you know, over by in Heber City. As I drove toward the car wash and saw an empty stall, I was relieved, but to my disappointment, I saw another car turn in just ahead of me. I knew the time that it would take for the car wash had just doubled, and then I watched that time stretch even more. The fellow in the pickup truck ahead of me seemed slow, apparently groping for his wallet and then digging out some bills. Finally, he inserted a couple of dollars in the slot and things seemed to be moving along, but the machine rejected the third dollar. I took a big breath and told myself to calm down. Remember, you have to understand, if some of you are not like this, then you don't know what it's like to be a type A personality. You don't know what it is to hate being in a line more than anything in life and spend your life always trying to calculate how you can possibly do things as quickly as possible. So, you know, for some of you, you might think, what's wrong with this guy? But some of you might understand. I took a big breath and told myself to calm down. He started working on the bill, trying to straighten it out. He tried it again, got it rejected again, and worked at it some more. Are you thinking what I was thinking? Those machines have a slot for a credit card. He didn't have to go through all this. But he kept at it, and I wondered how long before he realized he didn't have enough acceptable dollars and didn't know how to get the ones back that had stayed in the machine. I was losing it. I just didn't have time to sit there all morning. And then something occurred to me. I was acting like my old self, and I had promised to be more patient. I've been trying to act more the way Christ would act in situations of that sort. So I told myself I wasn't in that much of a hurry. That's one of those kinds of phrases that you can use to calm yourself down. After all, it was a pretty morning. I could chill out a little and enjoy the morning air. Then the obvious hit me. I had some dollars in my wallet. I could see whether any of mine would work for him, and then I could use my credit card when my turn came. I reached for my wallet with one hand and the door handle with the other, thinking I would walk up and offer my dollars for his and see whether mine would work. Just then the drive ahead light came on. He'd found enough smooth dollars or straightened his crinkled ones enough that he'd paid for the wash. But I was changed. I'd thought the right thing to do, thought of him, not just me, and all my impatience had disappeared. I pulled up to the spot by the machine, paid, and then watched the washers work their way back and forth. Once the pickup pulled out, I drove my car into the stall and still felt good. It was such a stupid little triumph that it's embarrassing to mention it, but I knew it was important for me. I felt better all morning. I went about my other errands reminded of my little accomplishment. Or was it a big one? I thought the way Christ might have thought about the circumstances. I know that some people would have thought of it much sooner, but this patience thing is really tough for me. Thanks. It just occurs to me that my students who are here, that I tell them not to be preachy. That was pretty preachy. We've got about, 10 minutes or 5? Or, yeah. Okay, 5 minutes. Do you have questions you'd like to ask? Yes?
Can you talk about how you wrote 5 years or 17 years? What was your writing schedule?
Kathy chuckles as soon as she hears you say that. I'm sort of obsessive in that part of my life too. I mean, some people would not get much done if they had a lot of time on their hands to write. I do. And so I say to myself, 8 o'clock is starting time. That's when I go to work. And I try to be on the job at 8 o'clock. And so if I'm not sitting at my computer at 8 o'clock, I feel like I was late for work. Now, admittedly, I may, play a game of Spider Solitaire, or I may quickly check a few websites that I'd like to check and do a little email. But I say to myself, hey, I'm at work. I'm at my computer. And I don't let myself play around too long. I get to work. And I usually work most of the day. I don't stop to eat. I get myself an apple and some cheese or something and eat while I'm there. And so I usually work from 8 through sometime early in the afternoon, 2 or 3, and sometimes a little, not that long. And then then there are always other things to take care of that sometimes have to do with being a writer. But I do. I work probably. And when I'm teaching, I try to do that on Mondays and Wednesdays if I can. But if I've got papers to read and so forth, I may not always be able to do that. But when I'm writing full time, that's what I do. And you know, as I always say, that there's two ways to make a living as a writer. You can have a big hit. You can write one book and it just sells millions, and you've got money and movie rights and you've got it made forever. Or you can write a lot of books, and I've written a lot of books. Yes?
What's going to happen while you're on the mission, right? Do you have books still to come out while you're out?
This book that I read from just now is coming out in May, and then I have another book that I'm working on. I always promised I wouldn't write any more about the Thomases, but people kept asking me what happened to Diane at the end of Hearts of the Children. She was divorced, and they wondered what ever happened to her. And they would always come up to me and say, "So what happened? What did happen to Diane?" And I say, well, you know, she's not real. So I don't know. And so I finally decided I would write a Diane novel. I'm working on that now, and it's set in the 80s in Ogden, where she lives. And so that book will come out next fall while we're gone, and then there will be a period of time where people will finally get a rest from me having a book out every year of my life. To tell you the truth, it's sort of frightening to me to think of going for a year or a year and a half or 2 years without writing. It's so much a part of how I think about life and what I do that it is sort of frightening to think, won't I be able to write at all? Won't they? I'll keep a journal. I guess that'll have to do it, but I don't plan to work on any projects while I'm gone. Yes?
The World War II theme, what inspired you to get that as a background?
You know, the question was how I decided to write about World War II in the Children of the Promise novels, and then I've written about World War II in some other novels as well. My wife, sitting down here, kept saying, why don't you write about the 40s? I had done some historical novels for children that had been early LDS history, and I was thinking of doing some more historical fiction, and Kathy just kept saying, you have to write about the 40s. And I would, yeah, maybe I will sometime. But she got me thinking about it, that was a good time to write about. I think about the time I started was when all those 50th anniversaries were coming up for World War II, and a lot of veterans were starting to get to that age where they were starting to die off, and it just, there was a lot of attention came back to World War II right during that time, and I thought, you know, that would be an interesting time to write about. And I think as a writer who's trying to make a living, you always have to have both what I would like to do artistically, that sounds like an interesting time, and would it sell? And it seemed like both were there. One thing that had happened to me when I was on my mission in Germany in the 1960s, I had met people who remembered, of course, remembered the war very well. It wasn't that long after the war, but who remembered especially when the missionaries had to be evacuated when World War II broke out. And they had told me those stories. And one of the things they had talked about was that after the war, that these same soldiers would come back. I mean, these same missionaries would come back as soldiers and would come to visit the old wards and branches where they had worked. And it was such a, and then they would always say, we threw our arms around them, and we were so joyous to see them. And I thought, can you imagine being a missionary in a country, going home, going back and fighting in that same country possibly against people you'd met and loved there. So that theme had been in my head for a long, long time, that I thought it would be an interesting thing to write about. So all that came together. But once you've done a lot of research on a period of time, then you find yourself going back to it. So I've done some other Saboteur that came out last year, I guess it was, 2 years ago, and then some young adult novels. Soldier Boys has probably been the most successful book I've done on the national market, and it goes back to World War II also. Okay, one last question. Holly?
I did research
Yeah, well, you've done some awfully good research, so, you know how it goes, but there's no end to it. When I did the research for Children of the Promise, I spent basically 2 years reading a lot, but I did write some children's books during those years, so that I still had some things coming out. But I spent hours and hours at it, and spent a lot of time in libraries. At the time, there weren't as many things available online as on the internet as you can get now. But I just read lots of books. I started with big general books, and then came down as I started to say, okay, I think I'm going to follow this particular unit. Then I found what books were available on that, and then you just keep following every avenue that's out there. I use the newspapers a lot, the church archives, interviews, a lot of different ways that you can get at it. And then finally you get down, as you know, to that situation where you have a particular question. What was the situation here? And then you go try to find it. One of the things I always have tried to do is not to change history in the process of writing the novel. And I had a situation come up, for instance, where the character named Richard is in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and his ship goes down and he's injured. I needed to get him to Pearl Harbor, where his girlfriend was at the hospital as a nurse. My plot, that really would be nice in my plot if I could get him sent there. But I didn't want to send him there if none of those guys went there. I didn't want to find out that everyone who went down there went to Guam or somewhere else, and that none of those guys were sent to Hawaii. And so I just started reading. There were big collections of oral histories from those battles and from various periods of time. And I read until I found one where he said he had gotten burned, which Richard had gotten burned, and that he had ended up in Hawaii. And so I said, okay, I can put it in my book. Thanks. It's always fun to be here, and Kathy knows that I find it very hard to write and to teach at the same time, and that I'm looking forward to doing one and not both, and then looking forward to a mission. But I know I will be nostalgic after it's over with. These have been good years. And I really do love BYU. I grew up as a kid who thought of BYU, But I love this place, and I love the students I've had here. I appreciate that so many of you have been here today. Thanks.